This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to our Family Forum series. It's a privilege to see all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. Rarely has this auditorium been filled with such an array of distinguished folks from so many diverse communities in Atlanta and surrounding polities. We have in the audience this evening friends and supporters not only from Emory University and the local neighborhood, but also from our sister schools at Spelman and Morehouse and ITC and Atlanta University Center, from the Leadership Atlanta Group, from the Concerned Black Clergy and other religious leaders, from the Housing Authority of Atlanta, from the Department of Health and Human Services, Wachovia Bank, the AJC, WABE Radio, the Atlanta Interfaith Broadcasters, and various other media and professional groups. We are so honored to have you here at Emory University, and we offer you a very warm welcome to our evening's proceedings. My name is John Whitty. I serve as director of the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, the sponsor of this evening's forum. Our center is devoted to studying the religious sources and dimensions of cardinal themes at the intersection of law, politics, and society. The booklet that you received upon entrance into this auditorium gives you some further information, rather ample information, as to what we are about. In 1997, Newsweek magazine carried a major story on what it called lost children in America. These were children born in poverty and in broken households, and more likely than not to drop out of step, out of school, and then out of society altogether. In 1997, that number exceeded 15 million little souls. That number would double in 2 decades, the story predicted, unless churches and states gave children and their families a new priority, and unless community leaders faced head-on the causes and the consequences of the breakdown of families and other traditional structures and forms of domestic support. This evening, we hope to begin an earnest, an honest, and a learned discussion about these very hard issues. Our speaker this evening is a national leader on these questions in a variety of communities, not least African American communities nationwide. Our speaker this evening is Professor Robert M. Franklin. Professor Franklin is one of the intellectual treasures of this Emory University campus. He is Presidential Distinguished Professor of Social Ethics at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University and Senior Fellow in our Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion. He has served as President of the Interdenominational Theological Center here in Atlanta, as Professor of Divinity at Harvard and Colgate-Rochester Divinity Schools, as Program Officer on Human Rights and Social Justice at the Ford Foundation, and in sundry other professional callings. He has written a number of celebrated and scintillating essays and book chapters and articles and books on a variety of issues pertinent to our topic this evening. 2 of his books have won enduring palms in many quarters of this country and indeed abroad. They are Liberating Visions, Human Fulfillment and Social Justice in African American Thought, and Another Day's Journey, Black Churches Confronting the American Crisis. He is now hard at work on a new volume in collaboration with researchers at ITC and at Emory, tentatively entitled A Crisis in the Village, Restoring Hope in African American Communities. This evening, we get an advanced peek into some of the preliminary findings and preliminary recommendations that Professor Franklin is reaching in this important book in the making. Will you please join me with a robust round of applause to welcome to this lectern our friend, our colleague, our brother, Professor Robert M. Franklin.
Thank you a great deal to President Wagner, to Provost Lewis, to Dean Russell Ritchie of the Candler School of Theology, to the leadership of the law school, to all of my friends and colleagues. I'd like to thank the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion for this opportunity to advance this conversation here on this campus. I'm privileged to serve as one of over 24 senior fellows at the center. Dr. John Whitty and his terrific staff, some of whom you'll meet tonight, are giving wonderful leadership to this important national resource. And I hope each of you will acquaint yourselves with this treasure. I'd like also to thank my wife, Dr. Cheryl Franklin, and my many other conversation partners and friends, many of you in the audience here now, who have both challenged and taught me much of what I know about the subject matter at hand. To the extent that my knowledge is limited or my interpretations inadequate, I regard it as a reminder that I need to remain in conversation with these wise people. I thank you all for coming out on this brisk Chicago evening. In the spirit of a State of the Union address, our purpose is to consider a response to Bill Cosby's recent campaign to revive a culture of personal and parental responsibility, especially in poor communities. Now, Cosby is a comedian, but he's making people mad. He is a consummate entertainer, but he is decidedly not attempting to amuse us now. He has indicted some African American adults for accepting a culture of mediocrity, materialism, and moral indifference. He has scolded the churches for failing to regard this crisis as a threat significant enough to radically change business as usual. He has chastised the American middle class and institutions of civil society for not being sufficiently angry enough to coalesce to change this situation. He acknowledges that government and the market could do more to support fragile families and promote better citizenship, but he places the weight of his analysis on individual and community self-determination. In essence, the wonderful statement made by Rabbi Joachim Prince at the historic March on Washington in 1963, I think, really captures Cosby's outlook. In reference to the Holocaust, to slavery, and to other historical outrages, Rabbi Prince said these words: "While few were guilty, all are now responsible." In other words, relatively few parents are guilty of the behavior that Cosby has targeted. Fortunately, a majority of people and families living in poverty make good decisions, rear children responsibly, and generally behave responsibly. All of us who bemoan multi-generational poverty as a social phenomenon must also bemoan and condemn the policies that make it difficult to escape poverty, including our current tax policy, housing policies, as Frank Alexander of this faculty speaks to so well, criminal justice policy, and wage labor practices and policies. If we limit our analyses and our indignation to the visible expressions of low or no income people, to inadequate education, impoverished dreams, and crude or rude behavior, then we risk blaming the victims of failed economic and public policy. Some of Cosby's harshest critics have articulated this concern. But ultimately, we must demand and design policies and practices that support people who make an honest effort to live better. Our fellow neighbors deserve the assistance of a society that has a moral commitment to supporting individuals and families in the journey towards self-sufficiency. Now, few of us designed wretched school systems. Few of us made the decisions about locating businesses and jobs in faraway suburbs. Few of us commissioned the housing that working people cannot afford. But all are now responsible for what passes today for the American dream. Let's begin by stipulating that Cosby is not the first public moralist to call attention to, if you will, the underside of urban village life. Scores of preachers, teachers, scholars, and artists have weighed in on these issues before, often more systematically, sometimes more colorfully. But at a time when a growing number of African Americans are unchurched, it may take an unconventional public moralist to reach this generation. And ironically, allegations of moral failure in a moralist's own personal life can enhance his or her credibility or street rep in communities that are accustomed to imperfect role models and messengers who defy the tenets of bourgeois morality. I would submit that there are 4 reasons why Cosby stands out. Reasons that boil down to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, didn't think I'd be quoting him tonight, he paid for this microphone. Or is it a megaphone? First, Cosby's award-winning, long-running television program, The Cosby Show. It revolutionized the way America and the world perceived black families by relativizing the usual focus on black family pathology. Cosby became a consummate marketing expert and advocate for the modern black family of hardworking, accomplished mother-father professionals who rear great kids and enjoy affluent lifestyles. Second, Cosby is one of the few visible multimillionaire black celebrities who has put his money, lots of it, where his mouth is. Before it was in vogue to do so, he and Dr. Camille were philanthropic leaders making generous gifts to historically black colleges, especially Spelman and Morehouse, and other institutions. Third, he has written books that outline his vision for effective parenting and educational excellence, demonstrating a theoretical sophistication in the fields of social psychology, culture, and education. And finally, tragically, he has stood over the gravesite of his own son, his own murdered son, and watched the effort, the excellence, and the investment he and Camille made laid to final premature rest, something no parent should ever have to do. He is in a small class of other celebrities who take up campaigns for social change. Harry Belafonte, Ruby and Ozzie Davis, Stevie Wonder. But he stands apart from them, I'd argue, in part because he's gone on the offensive to challenge the internal dynamics of black life rather than the usual focus upon the external foes of institutional racism and social injustice. He has engaged a sensitive and volatile set of issues that most leaders have been content to discuss only privately in barbershops, beauty salons, and cocktail parties. Crisis in the village. Before responding directly to Cosby's social diagnosis, I'd like to both join his analysis and expand it by locating this conversation within a broader institutional and cultural framework. Currently, I'm working on a book, as John mentioned, titled Crisis in the Village, Restoring Hope to African American Communities. Hope to be complete by next year. I'm arguing that there are 4 institutions that have played heroic parts in leading African Americans to freedom. They are the family, the church, historically black colleges and universities, and those institutions that occupy the nonprofit sector, especially civil rights organizations. During and after the decades of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, each of these institutions played an extraordinary role in facilitating the journey to citizenship made by Americans of African descent. All are now in a state of crisis. I define crisis here not as mere breakdown, chaos, or confusion, but as a state of rapid transition, requiring careful strategic decisions and a commitment to follow through action. Crisis as rapid transition, requiring strategic decision and action. Consider the churches. There are between 50 and 60,000 black churches in America. Black churches are asset-rich institutions. They have talented leaders, armies of potential volunteers, a weekly cash flow, available meeting space, track records of service, trust and credibility in most neighborhoods, and generally offer a positive culture of uplift, hope, and empowerment. The oldest of them were founded before America became a republic. Without the presence and work of these churches, the civil rights movement would not have occurred, and America would still resemble apartheid South Africa. Indeed, I often refer to the civil rights movement as a revolution led by preachers, church women, and Sunday school children. I'll suggest that the churches now face a mission crisis, a crisis of mission. They are caught between serving simultaneously the needs of the poorest of the poor and being user-friendly institutions for their upwardly mobile paying customers. Most mid-sized, large, and mega churches are well suited to assist the mobile middle class, affluent achievers, and wannabes. But generally, they do not appeal to people on the economic margins, a tragic irony given the life and message of Jesus of Nazareth. Second, out of the more than 3,000 colleges and universities in the United States today, there are only 115 HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, 115 out of 3,000, and yet that tiny number has educated more than 40% of African Americans who hold undergraduate degrees. Clearly, they are bearing far more than their fair share of educating a middle class that transformed black America, or produced a black middle class, as we know so well in Atlanta, within a generation, and contributed to the entire nation. But today, they are facing a crisis of relevance and purpose. So the churches face a mission crisis, like colleges are facing a crisis of purpose and relevance. As the best and brightest of black youth are vigorously recruited by the nation's finest majority institutions, and an unsympathetic public wonders aloud whether or not race-specific schools should continue, I happen to think that their presence is important to the rich diversity of our educational marketplace. In order to retain excellent faculty, however, colleges have to attract excellent students and provide excellent educational facilities to support excellent education. Some of these schools have devoted themselves to educating worthy students whose financial means and educational backgrounds reflect serious challenges. And some are dropping far behind in the marketplace of higher education. As we in Atlanta know only too well and too painfully, Morris Brown College has faced difficult times and is today struggling heroically now to re-engineer itself and return to its former place of glory. Third, African American civil society includes a vast array of secular, not-for-profit organizations and voluntary associations such as fraternities, sororities, community organizations, lodges, youth serving organizations, athletic clubs, and so on. I'm calling special attention to the plight of the so-called civil rights organizations. I want to really target civil rights organizations within the larger field of nonprofits. Groups like the NAACP and Urban League were established in the first decades of the 20th century aimed at helping the former slaves to enjoy the full rights and privileges of American citizenship. Despite an unfinished agenda, the moral and legal victory that they sought was largely achieved in 1954 with the Supreme Court's Board versus Board of Education decision, in 1963 with Martin Luther King and Rabbi Prince's speeches at the March on Washington, 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The moral and civil and political victories of the civil rights movement were largely accomplished in those years. Now, some today then would argue that those institutions or organizations have fulfilled their original mission and should either evolve new missions or go out of business. But the civil rights organizations have continued to pursue a variety of goals under the mantle of their original mission statements. Many of them face difficult leadership and financial challenges, as we all know. Here again, locally, we have lived through the painful melodrama of leadership changes at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. For me, in a wonderful moment of irony, SCLC's recent president, Martin Luther King III, spoke a good deal about retooling SCLC for the 21st century. But after his resignation, the organization began to experience significant challenge, crisis, rapid transition, requiring strategic decision and action. And in the midst of their crisis, what did they do? Looking forward, they reached back and found a mid-70-year-old Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, one of the founders of SCLC, a savvy Black Baptist pastor, to provide stability for the organization. I thought there was a moment of delicious irony. These organizations are facing an identity crisis, as they attempt to fight a new struggle with largely outdated weapons. Meanwhile, the community that these organizations were created to serve has voted with its feet and now ignores largely the financial challenges and crisis that grips many of them. Four, the Black family faces a crisis of commitment. In 1890, less than 30 years out of slavery, the percentage of two-parent African-American households was 80%. 100 years later, only 39% of African-American children lived in married couple households. In 1970, 68% of African-Americans were married. By 1994, that number had dropped to 48%. The non-marital birth rate in African-American communities today is about 69%. Although Black families have always grappled with crisis and have displayed virtues of resilience, tenacity, and flexibility, too many are now slipping into terrain that is uncharted and horrifying. Crack-addicted mothers who abandon their infants, children who grow up with no knowledge of or relationship to their biological fathers, parents who are incarcerated and depend upon the state or other family members in the village to rear their children. In my weekly journeys, I have seen, as many of you have, scores of talented, attractive women in the African American community who would like to be married and cannot find suitable or similar potential partners. I refer to this as the supply side crisis in our community of marriageable men. But also I meet men who are living, but not necessarily enjoying, the lifestyle of players and playboys. No intention of considering marriage, as they tell me, before their 45th birthdays. Still, other men are vocal about their unhappy single status and desire for a suitable spouse. I hear about children who would love to be adopted and married couples who are not able to bear their own children. I hear the demand of our gay and lesbian neighbors who wish to have their relationships legalized, and of the animosity that these demands engender in the hearts of otherwise loving people of faith. And I think, as I hear all of this, with so much energy invested in experiencing personal fulfillment within the context of a family or intimate attachment, Shouldn't we all be having a conversation about the future of healthy relationships, the future of marriage, and of parenting in our village? And yet, I see no evidence of a structured, ongoing conversation on these critical life and death issues for many people. The crisis faced by these anchor institutions, these four anchor institutions of our community, only exacerbates the social distance and despair that our neighbors in poverty experience. If the churches, schools, nonprofit organizations, and extended families of the village were fulfilling their mission, as they did in an earlier period, the growing number of youth who show signs of self-hatred, fatalism, despair, disrespect for elders, and so on might be abated. I'm suggesting that Cosby has vented his frustration over the visible symptoms of a larger, largely hidden cultural and institutional crisis. In the book, I'll argue that despite this dismal diagnosis, it is not hopeless and that we can overcome this crisis. Indeed, if the potential and power of just these institutions were properly aligned and mobilized, no matter who occupies the White House, no matter what Wall Street is up or down to, African Americans could significantly improve the lives of our children. That would represent the power of the people. This is what we can decide, what we can do while other institutions and resources are sorting out their priorities. And we hope standing prepared to work in solidarity with us as we transform the entire village. I'll say more about the elements of a strategy momentarily, but first a word about a puzzling dynamic that I've noticed as I've begun to talk about these issues in various leadership circles. This is titled Why We Can't Speak. In the post-civil rights movement era, there have been mountains of data, books, and information about the plight of young African Americans in poverty. But it seems to me that few nationally recognized leaders have treated this as a reason to dramatically revise their working priorities. One would think that with mounting empirical evidence, film, video, and musical dramatizations, and anecdotes about our lost generation of youth, or the endangered species of young black men, that influential leaders would have stopped doing business as usual to understand and to halt this madness. Surely mature, morally serious people would want to explore the potential long-term ramifications of the dramatic changes in black families and communities reported years ago by scholars such as William Julius Wilson, Orlando Patterson, and Cornel West. Indeed, the challenges facing these village youth and adults would seem to constitute sufficient reason to convene a series of leadership summits to grapple with this apparent internal decay. It does make you wonder, why weren't the most influential leaders in the community speaking with urgency and impatience about these issues? Why didn't these themes occupy the body of the annual addresses of major civil rights leaders and denominational presidents and bishops? Why didn't socially conscious disc jockeys blast through the radio waves to ask tough questions about where we were headed? Why didn't the pulpits of America thunder with words of love and instruction for prodigal children who had lost their way? The African American leadership elite, and here I include the NAACP, the Urban League, the churches of the Congress of National Black Churches, the Black Greek letter fraternities and sororities, and others, have focused on a wide variety of important challenges related to group advancement through opening opportunities and dismantling the remnants of institutional racism in the public and private sectors. Ironically, they have not launched a sustained focus upon issues related to faith and family. African American and other scholars from across the racial ethnic spectrum have churned out a mountain of disturbing, provocative reports on the consequences of falling black marriage rates, skyrocketing out-of-wedlock birth rates, and epidemic proportions of sexually transmitted diseases in our population. But almost no major African American public intellectual clergy person, civil rights leader, elected official, entrepreneur, sports hero or heroine, or other professional has made this a cause of sustained public awareness. Columbia University economist Ron Mincy puts it this way: while President Bush is conducting a public conversation about marriage and fatherhood, the African American community hasn't yet had the necessary private conversation about these issues that would facilitate a productive joining of the larger conversation. Mincy is an African American economist at Columbia. Now, during the past 2 years, I've traveled a good deal and engaged in a series of interviews and conversations that include focus groups with college students and seminarians, officials from the nation's leading civil rights organizations, scholars, policy experts, conservative and liberal think tank advocates, Muslim and Christian clergy, responsible fatherhood advocates, journalists, government leaders, executives in philanthropy, grassroots community leaders, kids on the street, and people who reside outside the United States for comparative purposes. In these discussions and investigations, I've listened to a host of compelling explanations for why the kind of conversation to which I refer tonight has not occurred. We've known this for a long time, and yet still, in piecemeal ways, in ad hoc ways, various organizations, as they feel led to, address these critical issues that affect the future vitality of our community. Let me just characterize them briefly because they are neither particularly new or particularly interesting. One is the fact that racism is still a reality, and some leaders, and with all due respect to them, suggest that leaders must not take their eye off of that ball. They can't dilute the impact of their work by focusing on too many issues. Some leaders are called to focus on fighting structural inequities and discrimination and happily leave the private realm of family and faith to others. There's been, or there should be, a division of leadership labor in our community, and they claim that they have devoted themselves to working solely in the public square. A second set of responses suggested that the obstacles that stand in the way of promoting stronger families and a stronger village are too overwhelming, and that leaders really like successes, so they take on manageable issues. This set of issues related to faith and family promises few successes, if any. And since we can't reverse the travails of history, we'll settle on being realistic about what we can effectively accomplish in one lifetime. A third set of responses that vulnerable minorities must take care not to have private conversations that might lend assistance to their political opponents, a version of the let's not air dirty linen in public argument. A fourth explanation or response, why aren't we having this conversation, is that these issues are too complex and solutions depend on individual choice, not upon collective action. There's no law requiring people to marry or little social pressure to conform to traditional expectations. The culture of individualism makes it almost impossible to persuade people to behave better if they don't want to. Ultimately, individual will trumps good programs and rhetoric every time. So why work against the grain of human nature, they ask. And finally, no one's perfect, that argument. Many of these leaders were willing to admit that they were not necessarily morally fit for this kind of agenda. Some of them have experienced moral failures, and you know the story. Although these rationales were offered as justifications for why they were not attempting to lead this conversation, no one suggested that the conversation should not occur, an interesting notation. Although some expressed extreme skepticism about the staging of such a conversation and how productive it might ever be. A few noted the model of the annual State of the Black Agenda panel discussions convened by two popular African-American radio personalities, Tom Joyner and Tavis Smiley. When such conversations occur, and are broadcast on C-SPAN, I should note, and other channels, they do in fact generate some buzz and ongoing discussion about these salient issues. but generally there is no action plan to keep legs under the issue. Now, to be fair, there have been a few noteworthy efforts to convene and converse, and I attended one such meeting in 1993 at the Baltimore headquarters of the NAACP. Despite occasional efforts to convene organizational leaders to deliberate about the future of the village, there has not been a sustained and visible effort that might garner broad support from within and outside the community. In reviewing the speeches and writings of these leaders over these years, it is surprising that more attention has not been given to the need to revive traditional village values of faith and family. In fact, as a group, village leaders have not been sufficiently strategic about coordinating, sequencing, funding, and constantly revising their efforts to ensure a better future for our children. Further, in order to restore hope to African American communities, these leaders should now, I'm arguing, convene a community-wide conversation about the future of our children and the practical steps, values, practices, and organizations that are needed to redirect our course. Now, my purpose is not to question the sincerity, integrity, or wisdom of any existing leaders, unless that is justified. It would be easy to note the shortcomings in the approaches of other leaders and to scoff at them for not being omniscient. Instead, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate their service and contributions. Their good and faithful service is responsible for the achievements and progress accomplished to date. But I'd like to invite and challenge these and emerging leaders, and many of you in this room, to consider a different approach to addressing solving our village challenges. We simply don't have the luxury of leaders who are not strategic and capable of leading change and producing results. Now, my sense of the disconnect between the rhetoric of major black leaders and the daily existence of large numbers of black youth emerged while convening workshops and focus groups of black clergy and also of black youth while serving as a consultant with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I'll highlight several of the findings or learnings that emerged from our conversations before moving to the formal response and conclusion. A report on this work, by the way, can be found at the Annie E. Casey Foundation website, and we'll have some copies of this report tonight for you. Currently, there's a national research project tracking the experience of over 3,000 low-income people in several states. It's called the Fragile Family Study. But one of the most surprising findings that emerged from interviews is that 82% of young unmarried men and women were romantically involved still at the time of their child's birth. 82%. Even more surprising is when the young people were asked if they thought that their relationships would move toward marriage, the vast majority wanted to get married and were hopeful that that would occur. Some scholars began to refer to this relatively brief period as the magic moment, because they found that after 1 year, after the birth of the child, only 16% of cohabiting couples got married, and only 7% of the visiting couples married. And as more time passed, fewer and fewer moved toward marriage. So the question emerged, if there are young unmarried parents who say they want to get married but ultimately fail to do so, is there something that the community, the church, and the government perhaps could do to support them in their own self-stated personal goals? Is it possible for the anchor institutions of the village, our congregations, colleges, nonprofit organizations, and local businesses, to step up and assist with this message development and dissemination? A second finding, according to researcher Catherine Eden in a soon-to-be-published book, Promises We Can Keep, many young parents did not get married because they held such a high view of marriage, so high that they felt that they weren't anywhere near having the material goods necessary for a good marriage. Many indicated that they wanted to first acquire a house, furniture, a car, better job, and enough money to afford an Ebony magazine wedding before getting married. Many younger people also said that they felt it was preferable to have children first and only when everything else was in place should marriage occur. This because to marry foolishly and divorce would desecrate the high and holy institution of marriage. Fascinating reports in these interviews. Professor Eden noted that women and men in low-income neighborhoods had higher views of marriage than their middle-class and affluent counterparts. I would add that many of these young people also had unrealistic views about what must be in place before marriage, such as the statement made to Ralph Smith, the vice president of the Casey Foundation. One young man indicated, although he was living with his friend, he said, "I can't marry her. We disagree about too many things." Seems to me there's an appropriate role for the anchor institutions of the village to reality test such naive assumptions. And some of us have been married 20, 30, 40 years and still disagree, so you don't have to have that worked out before you commit. Third, in focus groups with younger pastors in low-income communities, I heard this interesting statement: our kids don't know how to go out on a healthy date, a healthy, innocent date that doesn't involve sex. We need to revive a culture of healthy dating and healthy relationships. Now, due to the negative impact of popular culture, rap videos, Madison Avenue fashion culture, and the constant ubiquitous TV images, many of our kids assume that a date has to involve sex. Disseminating information about healthy relationships and dating is one of those easy or low-hanging fruit issues that I hope every congregation, university, and social group will soon implement for the benefit of our kids. And fourth, the single most common reason for relationship dissolution among poor married people was domestic violence. We all expected the reason why poor married folk, their marriages dissolved, was infidelity or criminal behavior. Those two followed far behind domestic violence. It was a shock. That means there are a lot of ugly relationships out there where innocent people are being brutalized, especially women and children. But to which set of culturally sensitive institutions can they go when things go south? Unfortunately, most clergy are not trained to effectively handle or respond to domestic violence, and most wisely refer people to secular agencies. But some clergy who feel that they must know all and be all to everyone advise women to return to life-threatening relationships in the name of love and faith. This is a cause for village-wide action. Here again, a largely unnoticed and inadequately discussed topic in our communities to which anchor institutions could bring new energy if properly prepared to do so. Now, the heart of the matter as I move toward conclusion. What did Cosby call for? You've all heard some version of this message that he began to deliver in May of 2004. Let me see if I can do justice to his now really evolving and expanding message with this brief summary. In the presence of that elite and racially mixed audience gathered to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Cosby expressed disappointment with segments of that one-third of the African-American population that lives in poverty, and many in extreme multi-generational poverty. By the way, in the film currently out, $1 Million Baby, there's a chilling portrait of white poverty that most Americans rarely acknowledge, but will be confronted with as they view this extraordinary movie. Cosby has suggested that while civil rights organizations and other public and private institutions have been working to alleviate poverty during the post-civil rights movement period, many poor people have not kept their part of the bargain, end quote. He acknowledges a social contract wherein the haves should work on behalf of helping the have-nots to have more. But the have-nots, he argues, have to put forth a decent effort to take advantage of available paths out of extreme poverty. Now, for a variety of reasons, this is no longer happening, he suggests. He then goes on to enumerate a variety of symptoms of the psychology of poverty, if you will. First, that many people living in poverty make ill-considered consumer decisions, like spending limited resources on expensive gym shoes instead of hooked on phonics programs while the kids are failing basic English classes in school. Of course, you don't have to be poor to make bad decisions, consumer decisions, but that's not Cosby's focus. Second, that many parents living in poverty show enormous concern about the welfare of their children once they have been arrested and are incarcerated and are about to be sent away for a long period. But they seem to have neglected opportunities earlier on to teach character lessons that might have prevented the criminal behavior. And then third, Cosby has expressed misgivings about the decision of many black people, not just those living in poverty, to adopt legitimate African names and African-sounding names and to use Ebonics outside the village in the larger public square, the workplace and the school and so on. This, he argues, will be a cultural liability in the job market. Now, he's confident that this situation is remediable, it can be changed, and that every member of the community must now take drastic action to reverse these negative cultural trends. Now, in black church culture, as most of you know, communication happens in an antiphonal rhythm. That is to say, it's call and response. When the preacher issues a call, the congregation responds. In fact, let's just test this now. Let the church say amen. Amen. Okay, it even works in the law school, Dean. That's extraordinary. It is, in fact, odd for listeners to agree with a message but do nothing or say nothing in response to it. So I'm suggesting that the leadership elite's silence and inaction is curious and disturbing. Now, this is the purpose of my modest effort to formulate a strategy and an action plan through which we can go beyond verbal or intellectual agreement with Cosby's wake-up call to institutionalizing a response to it. Indeed, I think that each of the village anchor institutions could reverse part of their own crises by mobilizing a response to these pressing community problems. In other words, there's an important role for the religious organizations, educational institutions, civil rights organizations, and extended families in revitalizing communities in crisis. Well, we've heard the sermon, we've heard the call. It's now time for the response, and I hope a strategic one. We have, I think, an obligation and an opportunity to respond in a more robust and coordinated way, and this is what I think we should do. First steps. In direct response to Cosby's call, I'd like to suggest that we agree to start with two very concrete, high-priority action items. There are many, many issues that one could select, and many of you will be advocates or brokers for your own pet issues. There are also many worthy organizations out there across the landscape already working on these issues and a variety of others. But the two that I would privilege. Number one, given America's swollen prison population, every year over 640,000 prisoners are released into our communities now, and this is 200,000 more than 10 years ago. In the next 7 years, I would suggest, we should reduce by 50% the number of young black men and women who are incarcerated and who are arrested and sentenced for violent crime. Cosby asks parents who weep in the courtroom over a son convicted for murder, where were you when he was 12? Where were you when Jamal was 5? We must stand with those overwhelmed mothers and fathers who don't know how to equip their kids for a productive life in this changing economy. The men who are tonight sitting in prison are not available to become anyone's husband and are not available to rear their own children. Churches, college, and nonprofit organizations should develop a coordinated action plan to ensure that every prisoner scheduled for release will be received into the community with lots of community supports. Let's make those brothers marriageable, or at the very least responsible for their kids and respectful of the women in their lives. Most of us wouldn't mind writing a check to support institutions that are engaged in cutting-edge change and making a difference in those issues. What might happen at your next church or mosque or synagogue or community meeting if you introduced a resolution to make such a proposal an action item for your organization? A second, in order to revive a culture of healthy relationships and reduce the vulnerability of our kids, let us consider dramatically raising the annual marriage rate in our community. Not marriage at any cost, but healthy marriages. Nearly all the literature tells us that people who are married live longer, are healthier, have more financial assets, take fewer life-compromising risks, enjoy more frequent and better sex. Some would say, speak for yourself. They have fewer serious illnesses and experience less depression. And kids who are reared by their own biological parents tend to do better than those reared in all the other alternative arrangements. No guarantee, but they tend to do better. They tend to complete more years of schooling, drop out less, have less juvenile criminal behavior, better physical health, less depression, lower rates of suicide. They delay first pregnancies longer, and so on. Even if only some of this is true, wouldn't it be exciting to see the entire village working together on reviving a culture of healthy relationships? Not all of us will marry or want to marry, but that should be a reasonable option for nearly every adult in the community. Starting in elementary school, let us ensure that every child understands the skills for good interpersonal relationships. Many people have deep psychological wounds that prevent them from having healthy relationships. Let's identify them early and do what we can to correct and heal them. All of us need help with how to negotiate the new world of egalitarian gender relationships in a respectful way. If your church, mosque, nonprofit organization, or school doesn't have a curriculum on healthy relationships and what to do when things go bad, then I would submit that you have work to do starting tonight. Now, as for his concerns about Afrocentric naming, culture, ebonics, I'm less worried than Cosby is, and in fact would take issue with a part of his analysis. As long as parents select names that have meaning and teach the kids those meanings, America can grow to accommodate and respect African culture just as it learned to do with Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Latin cultures. Senator Barack Obama proves that America can change and grow. Now, in order, in conclusion, to jumpstart this conversation, I would submit that we need to convene village-wide conversations about the future of the village and especially the bedrock institution of the family, not just in the Black community, but in all of our villages. The data tell us that marriage, family, and child well-being are in trouble across all American communities. Responsible leaders of our communities should convene town hall meetings to address questions such as, what do we expect from every father and mother in this community? What can we guarantee to all of the children in our communities? What things do people who are considering divorce need to think about? What can people who are being abused in relationship, where can they turn for help? What should each congregation in this zip code be doing to provide safe space in the after-school hours? How can the faculty and students of our colleges be used to help revitalize educational excellence in our toughest communities? And how can we intensify our efforts to educate young people about the life-threatening risks of unprotected sex? How can we protect traditional families while respecting the aspirations and rights of our homosexual neighbors? These and similar issues must be on the agenda for an ongoing conversation. We don't need these village conversations to become talk fests. Rather, we need fresh information, data, and stories about what's working out there. That means we'll need university scholars and nonprofit leaders with expertise in these fields to help resource the conversations. As for venue, they can be convened in houses of worship, barber shops, restaurants, and maybe even in symbolically significant places like the King Center or Morris Brown College's campus. Second, and I will wrap up, and this text will be on the website. Second, I want to suggest that we're going to need curricula and training in order to prepare leaders who will convene and guide those conversations. The good news is that the resources and curricula necessary are already in place. All we have to do is make a demand for them. Third, money will be necessary to sustain this process, but I don't think a lot of money, but sufficient resources to incentivize the process, and again, to train leaders and put people in the field. Fourth, I'd suggest that we set a period of time by which we want to measure progress, particularly in the two issues of prisoner reentry into our communities and promoting a culture of healthy relationships, where we can measure 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, the significant progress that has been made. I would submit that no matter how busy we are, everyone here could spend 2 hours per month attending a fascinating and lively town hall meeting in which you might hear cutting-edge information about how to improve your relationships, about how to enhance the lives of all of our children, about how to prevent negative forces such as disease or cultural messages that compromise the legacy of strong families. Fifth, I'm suggesting a new style of leadership is necessary for this revitalization in the community. In the past, we've invested inordinate hope and faith in the charismatic leaders who distinguished themselves from all others and were rewarded for their virtuosity. I want to suggest that we need something closer to charismatic servant leaders who are judged by their ability to collaborate with other leaders, who don't necessarily think about the mission of their organization as altogether distinct and separate from other like-minded organizations. And I would suggest that their compensation be pegged to their success in building collaborative relationships. In this way, the community can hold leaders more accountable. And seven, much of the work in reviving African American villages must be undertaken by African Americans. But our ultimate success will depend on the cooperation, support, and goodwill of the larger community. Leaders such as Mary McLeod Bethune, Benjamin Elijah Mays, Martin Luther King Jr., and others understood this well. Traveling with our friends, we can travel longer and farther. Now, who will convene the conversation? Who should start this? I'd submit if we take a page from the past, the village elders have the ability to issue invitations that everyone tends to respond to. We can pick your own set of favorite leaders or elders, but people like Andy Young and Marion Wright Edelman, John Hope Franklin and Oprah Winfrey, Reverend Gardner Taylor and Ruby Dee, even Bill Clinton could be a part of this effort. But the elders can't do it alone. We've got to also unleash the creative energies of the emerging younger leaders, some of them in this room tonight. The younger leaders, look at how Sean P. Diddy Combs and other rap artists emerged during the national election to mobilize and energize younger voters. Naturally, this work would be recorded and reported widely in the community. Well, I hope that you find this proposal not altogether naive and hopeful, but worthy of more than a casual amen, brother. In order to reduce the vulnerability of our children and to improve the life in our villages and ultimately to strengthen our democracy, we should all do what we can to ensure that every person achieves her or his fullest potential and contributes to the common good. I am disturbed by Cosby's call, but I am hopeful about the response we can make together. And I am hopeful that even complicated, difficult problems can be unraveled, disaggregated, and slowly transformed. After all, there is that story in the Gospel of Luke about the prodigal son who left his home, a place of comfort and familiarity, and found himself chasing a dream, and ultimately found himself in a strange and painful place. But something deep inside that prodigal son told him he was sick and needed to get well. Something deep within would not let him go. Something within drove him back to his village, back to his family, back to his sanity. Maybe what it was part of the echo he heard of the village concern, of village conversations going on about his future. He heard that echo, and he remembered that somebody cared. He came home, and a healthy father received a sick son, and all of the village rejoiced. Well, Cosby's issued the call, and it's our turn to respond. Remember the words of Rabbi Hillel, who declared that the world is equally balanced between good and evil, and your next act will tip the scale. Thank you for listening.
Robert Franklin, that was fabulous. He deserves another round of applause, I think. That was just beautiful. I can't wait for the book. It will be a top seller when it comes out. Look for it 18 months hence. A Crisis in the Village by one Robert M. Franklin, who this evening has proved himself to be a superstar. We have a conversation that Professor Franklin has started, and we would like to engage you in that conversation. We would like to invite you to ask some questions of our distinguished colleague. If you would be so kind as to oblige two rules of order in this House. One, brevity is the soul of wit, and the insistence of witty. Please be brief and profound in your remarks. And number two, would you be so kind as to come to one of the two microphones in the aisles that's halfway up the auditorium. For those of you for whom travel to the microphone is prohibitive, we can bring the microphone to you. But we'd like to be able to record your question to Professor Franklin. Be brief, be profound, be provocative, engage the conversation. May I invite anybody to come forward for the first question, and Professor Franklin will recognize you.
Dr. Franklin, one of the questions that I struggle with as a local pastor to a predominantly African-American community, a lot of what you said is concentrated in the village, and thinking of the reforms of King Josiah with Israel coming back, there were a lot of things that he told them to do, that they've got to abandon the larger culture, to get rid of the foreign women, a lot of the habits that they had picked up. And a lot of what I heard you say is what I try to say to my congregation, but I'm also hesitant as to whether or not I'm becoming a resegregationist. How do we hear the response of Dr. Cosby? How does the village respond in such a way that we do not resegregate, but we use the larger community to help foster what you're talking about?
Thank you. You may be familiar with the wonderful African proverb that in order to travel fast, walk alone, but in order to travel far, walk with others. Again, I alluded to the wisdom that Dr. Benjamin Mays, Dr. King, and Mary McLeod Bethune, any number of leaders have exhibited, I think, in their efforts to lead institutions engaged in this sort of village revitalization, focusing on distinctives of African American culture, history, challenges, pathology, assets, hopes, and dreams. They did that work, and yet they were bridge figures. I would refer to King and Mays as public theologians, in that they were able to engage the larger American public in garnering support for the efforts at revitalization within African American communities. So I think that the larger American community can appreciate and understand those moments when we sort of need to do the caucus thing, when we need to turn inward and take care of our families and take care of our kids and, in a sense, bracket and isolate it for the sake of health. And, but ultimately, it is to sort of enable them if we're going to remain in this pluralistic nation, to function in the larger culture and in the larger society. So that effort to, say, segregate for a period, to empower and build confidence and build ego of kids who may have little experience competing in larger contexts, they may need that time apart together, building ego strengths. But ultimately, they have to be brought into the larger, wider game. And I think America can understand that and support that. Some of you perhaps heard, in fact, this afternoon, the great soul singer James Brown was being interviewed by Terry Gross in the NPR program and asked him in particular about this unusual song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And she said, this seemed to be an interesting departure from, many of the other messages in your song, much of it kind of celebration and a kind of party culture. And she said, how did people respond to that? And he said, initially, my non-African-American fans and supporters took offense to it. He said, but as they began to see some of what Cosby and what I've talked about here tonight in terms of deterioration within African-American communities, rising crime rates. The elders could no longer walk the streets but were driven indoors because their own sons, boys in the hood, were carrying machine guns and shooting each other down. So when they saw that, they said, James Brown, you need to re-release Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. He said that his white supporters affirmed the importance of this sort of intra-racial group solidarity and healing and transformation. So I think it can be done. I appreciate the sensitivity in your question. Please.
I just want to thank you very much for your grasp, your intellectual presentation, and more than ever, of your strategic plan for the situation. I am Dr. Edna Toller. My mission here is the Bioethic Family Living Institute. It is an institute for the past 8 years, beginning in Selma, Alabama, when I returned here from Jamaica to help redevelop Selma University on that historic march. All I'd like to do tonight is to thank you and to say that great minds think alike. Fools seldom differ. I have been called a fool. My family are convinced, they're even taking it to the law courts, that I am mad. So be it. But I'd like to share with you tonight my journey of 42 years on that path. I would like to invite you to look at the lessons we learned in Jamaica. And I'd like to invite you that what we really need is a look at ourselves, redefinition and re-identity. The African is the first race of the earth. We are the leaders that are going to set the moral tone for the world. Because we know who we are, that's why we are so hard on ourselves. And I'd like you to read to this audience the letter I just finished this evening to the new Archbishop, Roman Catholic of Atlanta. I had the privilege of standing in his anointment. And that's all I have to say. That's all I have to give. But I know there is hope. And I'd like to invite you to look again at the United Nations International Year of the Family in 1994 that started me on this model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you. Yes, please.
Basically, I would like to segue off of what the sister just said. First, thank you for being here tonight. My name is Andrew Anderson, and I think that, you know, my journey, I'm 30, being a part of Generation X, growing up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, when crack hit, you know what I'm saying, being blessed and lucky, deciding to go into a historical black college, that experience there, coming and teaching in the inner city Atlanta where the students and teacher, faculty, everything is 98% African American. And myself and some of my colleagues discuss all of these parameters that you discussed tonight, including some of the things that you laid out in your plan. And segueing off of this, what the sister says, I've concluded that the bottom line is, even if you look at this election, I'm going to pose it as a question, but, you know, if you look at what happened with the Republicans and the race, you have whites in the South who identify with the South. You have whites in the North that identify with the North, and then outside that they identify with America when they need to get together to fight whatever foe, what have you. In my opinion, who do we, segueing off of what she's saying, who are we? When even tonight, you know, tonight, even when I listen to most African Americans talk, there's 90% of African American history just in America. I'm African, Liberia, raised by a Jamaican, all right? But when you, in this country, when I watch African Americans don't know 90% of their own history, and these were my instructors at HBCUs, who are we? We don't mention Marcus Garvey. We don't even know who not just the Nation of Islam, but the Black Panthers. You know, when it was time for war, they showed all the war movies for us to feel proud and American. You see what I'm saying? And they were violent and so forth, but they was patriotic. What do we have to offer our kids for them to even rally around, is my question. Who are we?
An easy question, huh? Who are we? Well, I think that one of the extraordinary cultural events that I lived through, and I suspect most of you in this room did, was in the mid-1970s, the television airing of Roots and the release of Alex Haley's extraordinary work of fictive history. And I think that a Roots phenomena has yet to occur for the hip-hop generation. Now, there are intelligent and very effective storytellers, and I have some of my students in this room tonight, Alton Pollard here, Brooks Pollard, and any number of them who are working now on the whole, on essentially the sort of moral messages in hip-hop culture and music and so on, and how they might be successful in conveying a sense of identity, of pride in self, of moral and civilized behavior that currently many of these kids don't get much of. And they're not going to church, and many of them have dropped out of school. So even those so-called anchor institutions that might have some reach really have relatively little juice, as the kids say, with those, or influence with those young people. So it's going to require some creative efforts. And I think that the story, the substance of what you're suggesting we need to hear again and again is, of course, a part and parcel of African village life, the role of the griot or griot, as we learned from Alex Haley, those who recite our story and tell us who we are, and remind us periodically of the travails that we faced, the strengths that we developed, and how we can face the future with confidence. Our kids aren't hearing that. They don't believe that. They don't know that. And so my hope is that as this sort of conversation takes off, and as institutions that are asset-rich, colleges, and not just, I've talked about HBCUs, but I read that really in a more sectoral way. So, you know, community colleges and mainline universities and so on. I think HBCUs have a distinctive role, but there are only 115 of those, and most of them are located in the Southeast, so they clearly can't do it at a national level. Other institutions will have to be enlisted. But we've all got to work from the same page, and that is what I suggest. We haven't yet tried that. That kind of coordinated, in the next 5 years, as we meet annually, we will confer with other organizations and churches and groups working on these issues, figure out where the gaps are. What resources are needed where? How do we deploy? If you need young male mentors in certain communities, and one community has an abundance of them and other communities have none, if we collaborate, we could cover those gaps. That kind of thing is what I'm hoping will emerge as we cover the material that's implied in your question. Please, we'll go to this side.
Dr. Franklin, John Evans. Appreciate so much what you're doing and bringing this out and serving as an ambassador. Would you agree that Dr. Cosby's statements in terms of our moral and cultural patterns that's going on in this country would kind of be akin to the God is dead theory and black power and black theology as it came out in the 60s and 70s to kind of stimulate us to get more aggressive in terms of what we know the call ought to be? Would you?
Yeah, I mean, a short answer to that, I think yes. I think he is being provocative, but I really do sense in him, he's been working at this in a kind of, if you will, Booker T. Washingtonian fashion for many years. What did he do? He's written books and that long process, and you hoped people will buy the book and read the book on fatherhood and so on. So he did that. That's kind of, what Bruno Bettelheim, the great psychologist, talks about. One of the tenets of bourgeois morality is that you have the patience to sit down with a book for several hours and read. So Cosby tried that. I think he feels that didn't quite take. Then television. What better medium to reach the masses? Well, that worked well, and the program obviously did well. In fact, my kids today watched this program in rerun, and I'm surprised. I thought, gee, well, I don't want to see the Cosby Show again. I watched every episode back in the, 80s. Here kids, 12, 14-year-olds today, they won't budge. They love this thing. So I thought, wow, this is extraordinary. And yet there's still people not being reached. So I think it was almost a kind of, an outburst, a rude awakening, a wake-up call to stimulate, to isolate, and to get people to figure out, are we going to act on this or not? And if not, why not? So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Dr. Franklin, it's Carl White from one of your students over at Emory. My question has to do with more of relating the social, cultural issues to economics. So many times you had mentioned reacclimating prisoners into society, but last time I checked, there's a phenomena that questions the very existence of society. It's called the working poor. Could you speak to the fact of why is there such a phenomena known as the working poor? Why do we tolerate it, and what can be done about it?
Yeah. It's a big question, an important question. It's a segment of the population that almost never was mentioned during the presidential election. I'll be interested to see if our president mentions the working poor at all tonight in his State of the Union address. Probably not. I think that most Americans are in denial. Part of it, we've got these cultural myths. There is, by the way, a terrific book, The Myths America Lives By. Myths America Lives By. Oh gosh, I'm blocking on the last name of this gentleman on California. Myths America Lives By. In any case, he talks about 5 or 6 dominant myths, and one of them, this notion of America as an innocent nation, America as a chosen nation, America as this sort of bootstrap nation which everyone can pull themselves up. So I think we're sort of blinded by some of the myths that we embrace. And so the working poor are relatively invisible for most people. If you have the job, if you can move them off of welfare and working, then we can stop thinking about that population. And yet, I think the last time I checked, something like half of those mothers who were on welfare, who are now working, continue to live in poverty. And so we're not finished yet. And yet I think it's our impatience with public policy that prompts us to move on. There are folks who are out there working every day and losing ground. They are not getting ahead. That's a real denial of the so-called American dream, that if you play by the rules, you work hard, you try to rear your kids and provide for them, you ought to get ahead over time. And in fact, they're not standing still. They're losing ground. So I think we need to revisit these myths and have that larger conversation. I hope that public moralists and theologians like you will help do this. Yes?
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Franklin. Donnie James. First of all, I'd like to commend you for the presentation. But one of the things I wanted to pose to you as it relates to the black family is getting back to the basic, the fundamental message. And, you know, I constantly have this conversation with my friends and wondering, growing up in a dot-com or instant society, have we gotten away? We get the job, we get the degree, we want the corner office, we get a page, we can make a call, we got microwave. We grow up in an instant society, and marriage is tough. You know, my parents have been married 50 years, and I'll tell anyone, you know, every day is not a rainy day, and every day is not a sunshine day. Have that hindered or have that harmed the black family, the instant environment that we're in now? That's the first thing. The second thing, self-love. You know, I'm a product of an HBCU as well as an Ivy League school. And one of the things that disturbs me is when I have a conversation with an African American and they say, well, I couldn't go to a HBCU because they party too much or they keep things stirred up. And I'm like, okay, CNN does their 100 top party schools every year. You never see an HBCU there. That's the first thing.
Brother, I'm going to have to ask you to move to your question.
Second thing, you know, you never hear a Catholic say, I can't go to St. John because there's too many Catholic, or Villanova. You never hear Jews say, I can't go to Brandeis because there are too many Jews. So when is it that we will stop the self-hatred? You know, if the current administration have their way, all African Americans are going to be coming back home soon.
Thank you, thank you. Professor Whitty tells me that we have time for only 2 more questions. There are 5 people standing. Can I ask if you all would just ask? I'll let all of you ask your questions, and I'll make a very brief response, and we'll wrap up. So if we could just do that, the kind of distilled form of your question only, that would help us. Sir, you. I think just the rear mics, or is this one? If you would go to please take your, while he's walking, sister, would you ask yours?
I'm sorry, I actually didn't have a question, but I had something I wanted to offer just in light of this idea of, you know, kind of where do we go from here and how to begin acting on some of these many issues that you've brought to light this evening. One thing I wanted to offer was, I think especially in terms of the idea of what to do with our young folks. I think it's really, really important. I think we do this a lot with this whole notion, the Generation Xers and all these things. I think it's really, really important to recognize the work that young people are doing and that there are some really incredible things that are happening. There's an amazing movement that's been happening for like the last 10 years in youth poetry. There's just a lot of amazing movements. I belong to a rites of passage group. There are rites of passage groups all over the country that are doing the very same kind of work that you're advocating this evening. And I think that in making this call, I really would just like to kind of press us to be open to looking outside of the kind of traditional institutions and structures for those kinds of leaders and for that re-envisioning of leadership that we're even, you know, looking for today, and just make sure that we are doing that.
That's a marvelous point. I take your point, and thank you for it. Yes, Reverend.
I'm not speaking for Dr. Durley, who's the pastor of Providence Missionary Baptist Church, or the church family. I'm speaking for myself. Responding to Cosby's call, I suggest that every pastor across this country, black, take 5 minutes before his sermon and speak to the values of family, speak to the value of businesses, speak to the value of community, speak to the value of investing in your community, speak to the value of supporting yourself. And I think we can work it that way, because all churches have people right there in front of them.
Yes, yes. Thank you, sir. Could we briefly take these final 3 points or questions? Yes.
Okay, in response to what you're saying about bridging between the have and the have-nots in the African American community. I just found out that it's really hard to do that, and my question is, two quick questions. What reason would a person, African American, who's worked all their life to get where they want to get, when they finally do get there, what reason would they have to help somebody in a low income and risk losing all of that, for one? And number two, what reason would a low income person have who's going to the government and going to all of these agencies who claim that they're going to help? What reason would they have to keep going back there when every time they go, they either get sanctioned or they get lies put in their files or they get bogus claims saying that they owe the government back all this amount of money just because they're being persistent and adamant and doing that?
Thank you. Please, next.
I just have a quick question about some of the claims that you made. The first is that you said that you wanted to raise the annual marriage rate in the black culture, and the second one was about decreasing the number of blacks in jail. And I noticed that it's more of, how do you say, an idea to fix the problem, which I agree with, but I guess my question is, why not prevent it before it starts? Why not begin to develop programs for young African American youth and prevent them from getting in jail, and then start teen pregnancy prevention programs that would prevent kids from having to make the decision whether or not they were going to get married versus going to college? And I just wanted to know why the petition that you made was more of a fix rather than a prevention.
Thank you. And final.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin, for having me here. I really enjoyed this seminar that you gave. One of the things I have is a comment. One of the comments is that you were talking about, I am interested in the youth. And one of the things I find in our black community is, like the brother said, who was from Connecticut, there's no identity. I believe that we have to break the chain of mental slavery, and our hurt and pain comes from that. We have not identified slavery at all. We have not even touched the subject. We are afraid of it, of dealing with that subject. These youth are crying out for help. They are hurting. I feel that some of the older generations have failed our youth. I feel once they know who they are, identifying, you can look at the old Negro spirituals. They sang about Ezekiel in the middle of the wheel. They sung about Moses. We sung about Daniel. We sung about David. Only a people who would know that would understand their identity. Who are we? We are the people in the Bible. Let's be real. We are those people. Until we find and give these youth the truth about our identity, how can we help them if we can't even help ourselves? That is my comment. Thank you so much.
Terrific point. Thank you all. Let me just, in 3 sentences, say I am tutored by the wisdom of the questions and suggestions offered tonight. I'll certainly take them into consideration as I continue to wrestle with and puzzle through what gets written and the talk and action that I hope follows from the book. I certainly mean to suggest that we need to place heavier emphasis on prevention and working earlier on. But at the same time, the power of faith for me as a theologian is that even those who have experienced trouble get a second chance. And so fixing those who are broken is something that we have to do. As to this question of the sister, why would folk who are doing well bother? Well, again, it is that something within. It is that call to action, to identify, to be your brother and sister's keeper. And I think that some people believe that stuff, as old-fashioned as it sounds, and they respond to those messages. Many don't, but those who do will be responsible for restoring hope in the village. Thank you all a great deal.
Well, thank you, Brother Franklin, for your wonderful call, and thank you all for the wonderful response. We would like this conversation to continue. We would like to invite you to continue to participate with us in the few minutes we have together after this forum. We would like you to look at the center website with the center website's address printed on the brochure, where you'll see a streaming video of these proceedings this evening, as well as the text of Professor Franklin's remarks. WABE will broadcast it on radio. The Atlanta Interfaith broadcasters will show it on television. Please encourage your colleagues, please encourage your friends, your students, your parishioners to avail themselves of this valuable resource and to continue the conversation this evening. Before you leave, may I invite you to do two things. Number one, please take note of the information that we have available outside of Professor Franklin's work, of the work of this center. Please also, if you would be so kind, take the blue form that you received on entry into the room and indicate for us how you learned about this forum so that we can be more effective in advertising future fora that are offered by our center. Please hand those to one of the ushers as you walk out or put them on the table, and we will gather those data. May I also ask you to join me in thanking my center colleagues that were instrumental in putting together this forum and were part of the planning of this activity this evening. I want to say special thanks to two of my colleagues in the center, Janice Wiggins and April Bogle, who were particularly effective, as well as Corky Gallo and Scott Andrews in our audio and video center, who have been so instrumental in putting together the proceedings this evening. I think it would be wonderful if we could give them a round of applause of thanks. And finally, may I ask you to join us for a lovely reception outside and continue the conversation casually. Thank you so much for being here. Please come back, look at the fora that we have available for you this semester. Come back anytime, every time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.